Hey y'all, it's entry number 38 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Cooper Kupp, wide receiver, Los Angeles Rams. We'll start with the positives with Cooper Kupp's fantasy profile. To start, we gotta talk about how he's one of the most talented wide receivers in the league. Cooper Kupp proved that he is one of the best wide receivers in the NFL last season, as he had the most receptions with 145, receiving yards with 1,947, receiving touchdowns with 16, yards after the catch with 855, and yards per route run with 3.33 in the league during the 2021 season according to Player Profiler. The next thing I really like about Cooper Kupp's fantasy profile is his high volume and targets. Cooper Kupp saw the most volume among NFL wide receivers during the 2021 season. He was first in targets with 191, target share with 31.7%, and red zone targets with 38 according to Player Profiler. In addition, he averaged the most targets per route run among NFL wide receivers with 34.1% according to fantasy data. Not many receivers are capable of seeing this kind of volume, which makes Kupp a safer bet in your fantasy league. The third major positive I like about Cooper Kupp's fantasy profile is his strong QB play. Cooper Kupp has one of the more talented pure passing quarterbacks in the league in Matthew Stafford. During the 2021 season, Stafford threw for 4,886 passing yards, the third most in the NFL, and 41 passing touchdowns, the second most in the NFL, according to Pro Football Reference. By having a quality quarterback throwing him the ball, it makes it easier for Kupp to be reliable in fantasy leagues. Moving on to some of the concerns with Cooper Kupp. To start, we gotta talk about how there's really nowhere to go but down. Cooper Kupp had one of the best seasons by a wide receiver in NFL history last year, where he caught 145 passes on 191 targets for 1,947 receiving yards and 16 receiving touchdowns, and capped it off with a Super Bowl win and a Super Bowl MVP trophy. Considering this was one of the best seasons ever by a wide receiver, and Kupp has only had one season with over 1,000 receiving yards prior to the 2021 season, back in 2019, it's hard to think anything other than there's nowhere to go but down for him in 2022. The next concern I have with Cooper Kupp's fantasy profile is Allen Robinson's arrival. Allen Robinson has been a pretty good fantasy wide receiver in the past. He has had 3 seasons in his career where he's had over 1,140 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns, including 2 of his last 3 seasons back in 2019 and 2020. It's possible that his arrival leads to slightly less usage for Cooper Kupp in 2022. The last concern I have with Cooper Kupp's fantasy profile is his average depth of target and unrealized air yards. This is really more of a nitpicky concern, but we'll include this information nonetheless since there's really not a lot of major concerns in Kupp's profile. According to RotoWire, Cooper Kupp's average depth of target during the 2021 season was 8.3 yards, which is a little below average. In addition, Kupp had just 498 unrealized air yards, 33rd among wide receivers during the 2021 season according to Player Profiler, which may suggest that there's less room to grow for Kupp than other wideouts. Some additional thoughts on Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp finished as the WR1 in Standard, with 294.5 total fantasy points and 17.3 fantasy points per game. The WR1 in half PPR formats, with 367.0 total fantasy points and 21.6 fantasy points per game, and the WR1 in full PPR formats, with 439.5 total fantasy points and 25.9 fantasy points per game during the 2021 season, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 season, in half PPR formats, Kupp had 0 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 10 to 14.9 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 25 to 30 fantasy points, and 3 out of 17 games with over 30 fantasy points according to fantasy data. During the 2020 season, Kupp finished as the WR34 in Standard with 116.7 total fantasy points and 7.8 fantasy points per game, the WR27 in half PPR formats with 162.7 total fantasy points and 10.8 fantasy points per game, and the WR26 in full PPR formats with 208.7 total fantasy points and 13.9 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. Sean McVay has been one of the more wide receiver friendly coaches in the league over the course of his career as an offensive coordinator or head coach, with his wide receiver room averaging 14.16 receptions on 22.02 targets for 186.78 receiving yards and 1.09 receiving touchdowns. By playing in a wide receiver friendly offense, Kupp should have plenty of opportunities to be successful. Former offensive coordinator Kevin O'Connell left to become the Minnesota Vikings head coach, and the new offensive coordinator will be Liam Cohen. This will be Cohen's first time as an offensive coordinator at the NFL level, but he did work as an offensive coordinator at the college level in the past. Personal opinion: Cooper Kupp is going off the board as WR1, about pick 3 overall, on ESPN, and WR1, about pick 4 overall, on Yahoo. This is the appropriate spot for him. To put how dominant he was during the 2021 season into perspective, in half PPR formats, he averaged 10 or more fantasy points per game than A.J. Brown, Michael Pittman, Marquise Brown, DJ Moore, Amari Cooper, and Terry McLaurin, which is absolutely insane. Do I necessarily expect him to put up the same numbers and have as magical a season as last year? No, I do not. But as long as he's healthy, you can feel confident that Kupp will once again be a WR1, likely a top 5 wide receiver overall, which makes him a strong first-round pick, particularly in PPR formats. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Cooper Kupp's My Cause My Cleats in 2021 was for Operation Progress, whose mission is to empower underserved youth to become educated, ethical, and productive adults who reach their full potential and positively contribute to society. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.